So much of the wine market can be understood as actually luxury branding, with, of course, a good deal of government regulation helping it all out. So let's talk a little bit about it. It makes a fascinating case study, obviously pertinent to current business. Just as we talked about with coffee, so too with wine. There are lots of commodity wines produced in very large volumes and sold cheaply for ordinary consumption. But then the higher end goes very high indeed. There are prestige varieties with price per bottle could be 100 or 1,000 times higher than the commodity stuff. That's quite a range. And plot spoiler, these differences in price do not seem to be explained by differences in taste or other measurable characteristics, which might suggest there's some quality that science just hasn't yet discovered or can't measure, or that many people are just not very sensitive to certain qualities of taste. Maybe brands are what matter most. I personally think brands do matter. There are memes about it's only champagne if it's from the Champagne region of France. But look, lots of musicians, popular figures call out certain brand names without even compensation. Sure, plenty of brands will make agreements with movies or something to prominently feature that brand with the hero. But not many brands have unknown startup musicians calling out the brand for its association with a certain lifestyle. Brand stories matter. These companies try to create compelling narratives to make an impact for consumers. Brands have tremendous value. Companies with some of the highest stock market values, representing immense wealth, have that value because their brands and their stories around them really matter. Consider the brand prism due to Capfra. Brands each have their own distinctive story, but this tries to pick out some common structures. Now, this is not only for luxury brands, but he refers to the producer as the constructed source to distinguish that the story about where something comes from might not be the actual source. Spring water, for example, is meant to be seen as coming from nature, but not some bottling plant, which is where it does actually come from. And the consumer here is referred to the constructed receiver. Again, because it's the idealized version of the user. For instance, while most people who wear, say, Nike clothes are not exactly in good shape, the idealized version of the Nike consumer is some athlete, right? So on the horizontal axis, he has this spectrum from external to internal. Some aspects of a brand are outside the actual product, while others are essential components. The physique refers to the physical characteristics of the brand, such as different shapes of wine bottles, if we're talking about that. The personality of the brand is more complicated and can include design aspects, writing style, font, color, or even just the spokesperson. Culture might often be national, although it can be constructed in different ways to highlight aspects of tradition, or it can be a company's internal culture, why it's different or unique. Relationship is how the brand relates to consumers, both in abstract and actual traits. Some brands are quite serious, some might even play hard to get. Reflection and self-image finally are related, but reflection is more about how the target audience is portrayed. The brand wants their consumers to be seen as something refined or serious or hip. Self-image is more about how the brand's consumers would ideally see themselves. It's all useful when we think about how these brands are constructed or put together. So I think a really good example is LVMH. It's a giant corporation formed from the merger of, LV, M, and H. Louis Vuitton, Moet Chandon, and Hennessy Cognac. It also now includes Tiffany's, Christian Dior, Bulgari, Sephora, Fenty by Riri, Chateau d'Yquem, Dom Perignon, Krug, Veuve Clicquot, Whispering Angel. company collects wines and spirits with fashion, perfumes and cosmetics, watches and jewelry. It's headquartered in Paris. Paris remains the world center of luxury brands. Dating back perhaps to Louis XIV, the Sun King, although many top brands didn't develop till the last half of the 1800s. But at that time, Paris was also the key ground for art and music trends. Artists that we know like Monet, Van Gogh, or Picasso. Now, Italy is a strong second for luxury brands. It should not be surprised then that many of the most prestigious wines are from those countries. Now, of course, there are geographic and microclimate rationales, but other locations have similar areas and didn't quite pop. Still, luxury brands are becoming more internationalized. 150 years ago, Paris was a global center for culture, but now there are a lot of other places developing new luxury brands. It's likely wines will become more diversified. Turning to some basic classifications of wine, the actual product that underlies these brand narratives, we can distinguish first some basic characteristics of the wines. They're red, white, rosé, i.e. pink, sparkling, and then other types, including dessert wines and vermouth, which is wine flavored with other things than grapes. Used to be commonplace, but not anymore. Red wine ferments with the grape skins, white doesn't. Pink does just a little. It is not the case, although sometimes people think this, that it's not the case that white wine is from light-skinned grapes. Skins can contribute tannins. It's that feeling of drying in your mouth. If you drink even just dark grape juice, you can notice that. Tannins are also the reason for black tea giving a similar drying, almost numbing taste. If you drink some tea and hold it in your mouth, you'll start to feel that kind of, buzz quite, but. Now, labeling of wines and grapes is complicated by long tradition. Some wines tell the grape variety. In others, the variety of the grape is implicit. You're just supposed to know that, of course, that there's only one possible or whatever. The top red grapes are Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, Pinot Noir, Syrah or Shiraz, and Grenache. Top white grapes are Chardonnay, Sauvignon Blanc, Riesling, Pinot Grigio or Pinot Gris, and Moscato. Even the names are complicated because variations in spelling and pronunciation indicate more about the geography than the grape. Syrah and Shiraz are the same grape, with legends that try to connect the grape to Persia, but those are just later fabrication. The grape is French. France has the highest status wines, reds from Burgundy and Bordeaux, along with Champagne. Other countries try to get as fancy. France developed the appellation system, where the government set regulations that designated certain locations as growing grapes that made excellent wines. These are given labels such as Grand Cru or Premier Grand Cru. Other countries developed their own appellations afterwards, as they realized those labels could be useful. They were originally justified as being for consumer protection, that somebody spending extra to buy a fancy wine should be able to trust what they were getting. Of course, the local landowners benefited enormously. And you don't need to be an expert in politics to guess that laws offering substantial benefits to big landowners would get support. We can ask, to what extent do these appellations actually correlate with geology, weather, microclimate, etc.? Meh. We'll get into more of those details later in the course. Wine preferences are complex, with variations between what experts like and what many people like, the drinkers. Generally, warm weather before harvest means more sugar, and more sugar means higher alcohol, and people like that. It's useful to review the basics of fermentation. Yeast are microscopic single-celled organisms which take in sugar and convert it into alcohol and carbon dioxide, CO2. If that gas is trapped, then we get bubbles. If they're trapped in a glass bottle, that's sparkling wine. If it's trapped in a barrel, then it's frothy beer. If it's trapped in gooey bread dough, then that's the holes in bread that make it fluffy. Fermentation is ancient because it's basically inevitable. If people store something with sugars in it, then the lack of sterile conditions means you'll get fermentation. Yeast just floats in from the air, falls into this stuff. There's evidence that humans were making wine and beer many thousands of years ago. The folks who built the pyramids got a lot of their daily calories from it. Wine grapes were originally found in Central Asia, north of the Caspian Sea, but were intentionally spread far and wide. But now we talk when telling kids about progress. In the old days, people believed in magic. Now we have science and all good things. But shouldn't forget that ancient people believed in magic because they saw it in their daily life. They'd fill a clay jar with grape juice and it would turn into wine, which would make people intoxicated. They'd feel really good. How else would you explain that? But they saw it every day. Our word, spirit, refers to both ghosts and magical beings like fairies and elves, as well as the stuff that makes people intoxicated, as if they were possessed by something supernatural. Now, if you're worried about CO2 emissions from fermentations, it's a circle, at least for that part. Plants take in CO2 from the atmosphere. They use the C, emit the O2 to make sugars. And so the fermentation is really just circling back. There are lots of historical sources of sugar. Grains such as wheat and barley would become beer or bread, depending on how much water is in the recipe. Fruit was a common source. Apples become cider. Pears become perry. Grapes become wine. Honey would become mead. Agave would become pulque. Before modern technology's sterilization, basically anything that was stored would ferment. People tried to harness that fermentation into good directions, and they made cheese or bread or wine or various foods. But soda, for instance, is only possible with modern technology to kill off the organisms that would otherwise eat the sugar, and then keep the container sealed off. Tech also allows distillation. We can take a liquid where sugars were fermented in alcohol, heat that until the alcohol evaporates at a lower temperature than the water, collect the vapors boiled off. The name of the final product depends on what was fermented, such as potato or corn or barley or agave or whatever. The process was refined by Arab scientists more than 1,000 years ago, and that's why English has the word alcohol. It's a loanword from Arabic. Distillation only became common, however, when industrialization made energy cheap, since boiling out the alcohol uses a lot of energy. Controlling fermentation and selecting yeast strains has been a major focus of biochemical research for centuries. Statistics, for example, uses the T distribution often, but it's not named for the person who figured out the T distribution in T-stats, Henry Gossett. Why? Well, he worked for Guinness Brewing. He graduated from Oxbridge, top of his class, from one of the world's most prestigious universities, got a job working on cutting-edge technology where he had to agree to confidentiality. But he was at a company that was the leading edge of R&D. Kind of like how nowadays Google would hire top grads. Fermentation is complicated. And although the basic idea is that yeast turns sugar into alcohol, there are a lot of distinctions. Slightly different fermentation temperatures, slightly different strains of yeast. Yeast could be more or less active. Then there are other microorganisms that also produce different flavors, especially acids, and those can be encouraged or discouraged in lots of different ways. Aging is also important. There are various biological processes both within the liquid, but also for some containers from those. If ferment in steel or glass, then you get basically no contribution from the container. Ferment in a wood barrel gives quite substantial contributions. Sometimes the wood barrel might be fired, which kills off the microorganisms there, but also provides flavors. And time matters as well, since some of these organisms are very slow in their metabolism. Mass market wine is usually meant to be drunk when it's young. Producers often blend batches. Mass market might just add different chemicals. But higher end sources, they try to get the outcome with limited interventions. Now, as we review fermentation, know that the yeast is totally brainless. I mean, it's literally just a single cell. The yeast cells in the grape juice do not look ahead and think, ooh, we're going to eat all the food, there'll be nothing left and we'll die. They just eat off all the sugar and then they die. They make their own environment uninhabitable for themselves. If that seems like a metaphor for what the totally supposedly not brainless humans are doing to the Earth's climate, yeah, we'll have to see.